these guys were using these vans. So this true crime thing, which is such a phenomenon now, back when I was a kid, news was regional. It would really have to become a significant event before it would end up on the national news. And I don't remember these particular stories as a kid. I'm sure they were. But this was before cable. So when you look at the world today and something happens in, I don't know, rural Idaho, in a place that has a population of 325 people, it could become national news in a heartbeat. Where things like this, I had no idea there was a serial killer boom in California. I actually didn't know that until probably the last 10 years, but I really wasn't, interested in the topic necessarily. But I will say this, during this time period, the one story that I do recall becoming national news, and it was the first time as a kid I became very, very scared about my own mortality. So somewhere, I guess, 84, 85 perhaps, was the story of Adam Walsh. And I remember being in third grade. I always forget, there were two teachers, and I always forget the second teacher's name. My homeroom teacher was Mrs. Howell, and the other teacher, someone will tell me this information and remind me who it was. And I think we had math in that classroom. And I remember this story, and people were talking about Adam Walsh, and like, hey, this kid got taken from the mall. And in my hometown, the mall was a big thing. We actually had two malls originally, and I'd love to explore that because people might remember the Meriden Hub, but most people know the Meriden Square. But this kid gets taken from a mall, and, they find only parts of him, or they just found his head and not the rest of his body. A heinous, terrible story. And it was like, holy cow, these kind of things can happen to kids. Like, this is crazy. So I kind of understand why generationally parents of my same age have tended to be much more, so my wife and I were not necessarily helicopter parents, but we've definitely been protective to some extent and really kind of, being cautious about where they go and when they go by themselves. Now they're older, so it's less of an issue, but certainly when they were younger. And I think part of it is because we came up in this era of, hey, this was a very powerful thing. Now, that didn't stop me from going all over town on a bicycle or on foot for all of my youth, and I wish that there were more places that this was, more prevalent. But I think a lot of places have become very kind of shut down, and kids aren't allowed to go ahead and play. And part of that is, the kids of my generation being parents. I also remember significant things that were newsworthy. For example, the assassination attempts of both Pope John Paul and President Reagan, the murder of John Lennon, and the Challenger explosion. And all of these events were actually like in elementary and middle school. Like, these were like critical things. And I mean, we watched the Challenger explode live. So this is just an interesting era of things that were happening back to back to back. And with Pope John Paul, like, I think I was in first grade when that happened. And I wasn't Catholic. When I grew up. I am Catholic now. I converted as an adult. But as a kid, I was a Congregationalist, which is a Protestant faith. But even I knew as this Protestant kid, like, this is the Pope. Like, that's not a target you're supposed to have. So the fact that like the Pope had almost been killed was a major thing, and kind of a almost like a precursor to the kind of what the world has become. Which also explains why there's so much cynicism in, as I said in the beginning, the music, the movies, and the culture, because this was a significant shift. You think about it, there was this happy-go-lucky, whether it was real or not is irrelevant, but there was definitely this view that the 1950s was the rise of the suburbs, and you had, the June and Ward Cleaver, and all of it was very nice, and it was a beautiful, idyllic time in history, and certainly it had its own issues, but certainly coming off of World War II, it was this kind of breath of, okay, we can live again, and we can have a different kind of life, and we're going to offer a better life for our kids, and that was like the whole, that's how you got boomers. The boomers were the first generation. We kind of, say things negatively about other generations and how they're so spoiled and coddled and safe spaces. But really, that's what the suburbs was meant to be for the baby boomers. So they were the first like suburb places. Those are the suburb families. They weren't rural; they were suburban. And it's just so interesting to me how then the '60s and Vietnam and free love and the summer of love and make love, not war, and just such a juxtaposition of wartime. But then Manson, again, California. Manson goes ahead and ends the summer of love by going ahead and taking that whole mindset in a completely different direction, one much more insidious and much, much darker. So I guess the question is, who are our heroes, right? Who are our heroes? And I remember Kurt Cobain, who's going to be a recurring topic as well. He says, our generation had no heroes to look up to. Now, occasionally, we would have a sports hero, right? Michael Jordan comes to mind, right? Michael Jordan, huge hero for a whole generation. But that's probably why we look to Luke Skywalker. He's the great hero. Indiana Jones, because the real world was lacking in heroes during this time. We didn't have Martin Luther King. We didn't have Jackie Robinson, or even a JFK. And, some would say Reagan during this time period, but he was such a polarizing figure, and became even uglier in that kind of post-Watergate era as far as how the news presented political opinion. And it became, in that sense, much darker. So perhaps in some ways, he had become a hero to many, and they talked about the Reagan Democrats, but history has a different view. So there was no hero. But then you end up having, music that was fun, right? So again, there's this cynicism that's brewing, but then you have like the hair bands, right? And the hair bands were all about having a good time. I think about the hair bands, and then we're going to talk about grunge, and then what were the other significant events. And for some reason, Terminator 2 just comes to mind as being like this massive thing, and Mad Max, and there was Moonlighting and Growing Pains. It's funny, Growing Pains, the mom and dad's name are Jason and Maggie, and my wife and I are Jason and Maggie, and we have 3 kids. I don't count Chrissy on that show, sorry, but it's boy, girl, boy, and that was Mike, Carol, and Ben. Anyway. But I do think that things started to get a little bit darker even then, and it was subversive, and people didn't necessarily notice it. So if anyone remembers the first Transformers movie, I'm talking about the animated one that was based upon the TV series. And again, spoiler alert, 30 plus years later, Optimus Prime died. That was a heavy thing for a cartoon. That wasn't something that you actually would have expected. So anyway, enough about all of that. That's just a basis for the whole podcast. What is it about? It's about anything that pops into my head. And some things go in different directions. Now, as I go along, I, of course, hope to get better at this. I hope to have guests on. And I'm going to start using social media more. One of the things that I'm going to do on Twitter is I'm going to have polls to post potential topics, let's say 4 or 5 different topics that might be of interest to you as listeners, which at this point might be 1 or 2 of you, but please vote 50-50, I guess. But I can tell you there's a couple of things we're not going to talk about, and I think this is really important, and some of you are going to boo me. I'm not going to talk about Goonies, and I'm not going to talk about Ferris Bueller's Day Off, because they suck. They're terrible, and if you think that doesn't make me Generation X, you are wrong. It makes me more Generation X because I reject those 2 garbage movies. The only good thing that Matthew Broderick's ever done is Cable Guy. Hey, Cable Guy, that was directed by Ben Stiller, who, by the way, is also another one of those directors that we're definitely going to talk about a lot because I think he's underrated as a director. He only gets kind of the kudos once in a while. So to me, I think about Quentin Tarantino. Huge. Kevin Smith and Clerks. That was a huge change in how movies were done because they got much smaller in scale. Same thing with Tarantino. He became more ambitious as time went on, but a lot of his stuff were, single set stuff early on, like Reservoir Dogs is a really small movie, but all about the dialogue. And then Ben Stiller. Ben Stiller did, Reality Bites. Such a kind of a classic little slice of the time period. Cameron Crowe. Cameron Crowe did Singles, one of the absolute best soundtracks ever. You have directors like Penelope Spheris, who did, End of Western Civilizations Parts 1 and 2, one about punk, one about metal. But then she also went on to do, mainstream films and comedic films, and just a hell of a director. So it's an interesting time, I think, and that's why I think the podcast is so much fun, because there's so much fertile ground to talk about. Because one of the things is it's still relevant even to my kids. Now you can say, well, sure, that's your influence on them. But I don't think it actually is necessarily directly just because of my influence as a parent in movies and music and all those kind of things, because we have a bunch of different tastes in music. I read an article recently that talked about Spotify and Apple Music and how old music is still predominant. And when you go ahead and look at the charts, Nirvana, for example, is still high up in the list. Now, mind you, again, 30 years. It's 30 years. There's been a little bit of a discussion because there was a lawsuit about that iconic cover with the little kid naked swimming in the pool, trying to sue them and saying that, ruined his life. When 10 years earlier he said it was the best thing that ever happened to him, and he's, famous worldwide. The music that we had still holds up. Do I think there's probably one or two artists that my kids say are their own that are going to last? Yeah. Taylor Swift is going to be one of them. People are going to be listening to Taylor Swift for forever. I'm probably showing my age here. I probably don't think there's that many others. I would certainly say that my kids love Drake. I guess he's going to be around for a while. Probably Post Malone. Again, those aren't really my things. Not because I don't like rap, because rap is going to be a recurring topic here as well. And in my opinion, we have some of the early days of really great lyrical rap, going from the very simplistic kind of Sugar Hill Gang, Run DMC, kind of mixing that rock and rap together, how that led into the gangster rap phenomenon with the groups coming out of, South Central. You had NWA, for example, how that gave rise to, the East-West stuff that was going on. Then you had the rappers who were going really super fast and double time, and just a really interesting evolution. But the kind of hip-hop that I listen to, my kids are like, we don't get it. Like some of the early, older stuff, they're like, we enjoy this. But it's just the evolution of music. On the rock side, there are very few rock artists, even producing music now. So I think that if you want good rock music, the kids are looking backwards. But then if they are producing rock music, it's either very milquetoast, very bland, very middle of the road. Very few bands that are doing things that are exciting and groundbreaking or changing things. And I think that's where I go back to the 1992 thing. So beyond the fact that I graduated in 92, if you think about, a school year, the school year starts in the previous year. So I start in freshman year in 1991. So in 1991, and I did not realize this, and another recurring topic, and I'm going to have a guest on soon to discuss this band, is Pearl Jam. I am not a big Pearl Jam fan. I really never have been. I like some songs, but that's about it. But they came out before Nirvana. Now, doesn't mean they were together before Nirvana. Obviously, Nirvana had a couple of indie releases beforehand, and before there was a Pearl Jam, there was one of my favorite bands of all time, and that's Mother Love Bone. So that's part of the reason I, despise Mr. Vedder. I know, it's not his fault that Andrew Wood had a heroin overdose. Nevertheless, 1991, you have 10 come out. You have Nevermind come out. And I think either late 91 or early 92, Bad Motorfinger from Soundgarden comes out. And this becomes that cultural shift. This was that stimulating moment. So really, when Smells Like Teen Spirit hits the radio, everything changes culturally. So Reservoir Dogs, Nirvana, all these things happen all at once. And it's like, holy cow, I'm about to go out into the world from the insulation of high school, and it's a different world than it was. It's not about Poison and Motley Crue and Warrant. It's now something